I think the hospital I'm working at is haunted, and I had a creepy experience. I've been the night janitor at St. Mary's Hospital for nearly 30 years. It's a pretty laid-back gig. Most nights it's just me, my mop, and the sound of the AC rattling through the vents. I've seen a lot over the years: rush surgeries, late-night doctor meetings, and families trying to hold it together. But what I started noticing in the basement, that's different. It's got me feeling like I'm losing it. It all started about a month ago. Now I'm the type who just does his job, keeps his head down, and gets out. No need to overthink anything. But lately something's been up with the basement. The basement is where they shove all the old records and broken equipment that nobody wants to deal with anymore. It's musty, a bit creepy, but nothing I can't handle. Been cleaning it for decades, but this one Tuesday night things took a turn. I was pushing my cart down the usual hallway, lights flickering overhead like always. That's when I smelled it, faint, but there's smoke. Not just any smoke, though. It was thick, nasty, like something was burning. My heart started pounding. Fire in a hospital? That's no joke. I followed the smell, heading towards the storage room, but by the time I got there, it was gone. Just like that. The room was the same old mess it always was: filing cabinets, dusty charts, and junk nobody's touched in years. No smoke, no fire, nothing. I figured maybe the AC was acting up, pushing some old smell through the vents, but then I heard it. It was real soft, almost like a whisper. It sounded like voices. I stood there, holding my breath, trying to catch it again. But nope. Silence. Just the old hum of the building. I tried to shake it off, but the smell and the voices kept coming back over the next few nights. Always in that same hallway near the storage room. The smell would hit me real sudden and then disappear just as quick. And those voices, they started getting louder, more distinct, like someone was having a conversation just out of earshot. But every time I'd check, there'd be no one there. After a week of this, I was starting to think I was going nuts. But then one night I saw it. I was mopping the hallway, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a light flicker on in the storage room. Now I knew for a fact I'd turned that light off. I always do. But there it was, flickering like crazy. I walked over real slow and opened the door. The light inside was going wild, flashing like a damn strobe light, and there in the middle of the room was this old wheelchair just sitting there. Problem is, that wheelchair wasn't there before. I would have noticed. It was like someone had just rolled it in while I wasn't looking. I backed out of that room so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what was going on. I locked the door and left it alone for the rest of the night. But things didn't stop there. Oh no, over the next few nights the weird stuff kept happening. Lights turning on and off, that smoke smell coming and going, voices getting louder, and every time I'd check, the wheelchair would be in a different spot in the room, like someone was moving it around. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on, so I did something I never do. I started asking around. Most folks didn't know much about the basement, or they just shrugged it off as old building quirks. But then I talked to one of the older nurses, Mrs. Connolly. She's been around almost as long as I have, and when I mentioned the basement, she got real quiet. "You ever hear about the fire down there?" she asked me. Fire? I hadn't heard a thing, so she filled me in. Turns out, back in the 80s, there was a fire in that very basement. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to cause some serious damage. A few staff members were working late, doing overtime or something, and they didn't make it out. They got trapped down there, and well, you can guess the rest. The thing is, one of the people who died in that fire, a guy named Ed, he used to be the janitor before me, and from what Mrs. Connolly said, Ed wasn't exactly happy with how the hospital treated him. He'd been there for years, but they kept piling work on him, never gave him a raise, never appreciated him. She said he was a bitter old man, and some folks think that bitterness carried over into the afterlife. I didn't want to believe it, but everything started making sense. The smoke, the voices, the lights, even that damn wheelchair. It all started after I moved some of the old equipment around. Maybe I stirred something up, something that had been lying low all these years, so now I'm stuck. I still work the night shift, still clean that basement, but I'm always on edge waiting for the next weird thing to happen. I don't know if it's Ed or just my mind playing tricks on me, but whatever it is, it's real enough to keep me looking over my shoulder. And every time I smell that smoke or hear those voices, I just mutter a quick, "Sorry, Ed," under my breath and move along. Maybe if I keep my head down and do my job, he'll let me be. But if there's one thing I've learned in all my years here, it's that some things are better left undisturbed. So I don't ask questions anymore. I just keep mopping and pray that whatever's down there doesn't decide it needs more company. We discovered something terrifying at the hospital. Hey folks, my name is Diego, and I've got a story that's been bothering me for a while. I work as a maintenance guy at a large hospital with my buddy Samuel. He goes by Sam, and we've been friends for years. We've seen a lot over time, leaky pipes, broken lights, you name it, but what happened to us recently was different. It was downright unsettling. So here's the deal. We were tasked with clearing out an old storage area that had been shut off for years. The hospital's got a bunch of these forgotten corners, but this one had been sealed for a long time. We were told it was just a relic of the past, but, curiosity got the better of us. When we pried open the old door, it was like stepping into a different world. Dusty old file cabinets, some scattered medical equipment, and a thick layer of grime. We figured we'd just get it cleaned up, but it didn't take long for things to get weird. First off, as we started sorting through the documents, we found them in disarray, papers everywhere, like someone had tossed them around in a hurry. Some of the files were labeled with terms that seemed a bit off. We brushed it off as old hospital jargon, but then things got stranger. Among the papers, we found some really disturbing old images, photos of people who looked like they were patients and the experiments they'd undergone. The images were graphic, showing severe conditions and procedures that looked more like torture than treatment. Seeing that was like a punch to the gut. It made everything feel even more eerie. We heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway, but when we checked, nobody was there. Sam and I exchanged that "did you hear that? Look," and kept going. Next thing we knew, some of the equipment, old heart monitors and IV stands, seemed to move by themselves. Not a lot, just enough to make you second guess what you're seeing. Sam and I joked about the place being haunted, but it didn't feel like a joke anymore. The room was freezing, even though the HVAC system was working fine. We tried to ignore it, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. The real kicker was when we found a room at the back of the ward. It was locked, but the key was lying right next to it. We opened the door, and inside was a mess, more papers, some old medical beds, and what looked like a weird setup for some experimental treatments. That's when things really got creepy. We dug into the records we found and learned that this ward had been used for controversial treatments back in the day. They were trying out unapproved procedures, and from what we could piece together, it didn't end well. The thought of people suffering in that room sent chills down our spines. As we continued our work, things got even stranger. We started hearing murmurs and soft cries that seemed to come from nowhere. Every time we turned around, the air felt colder. We even saw shadows flicker out of the corner of our eyes. Sam and I tried to keep our cool, but our nerves were shot. We decided to take a break and grab a coffee from the break room. As we walked through the hallways, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We joked about it, but neither of us were laughing inside. It was like the weight of the past was pressing down on us, making everything feel heavier. When we went back to finish up, we found more strange things. Drawers open with files scattered on the floor, and some of the medical equipment had been moved around. We knew we had left everything in order before, and it was unsettling to see it all messed up again. It was like someone or something was playing with us. By the end of the day, we were both eager to get out of there. We locked up the old ward and made our way to the exit, casting uneasy glances over our shoulders. I can't quite shake the feeling that something about that place wasn't right. Maybe it was the history, or maybe it was just our nerves playing tricks on us. Either way, I'm not eager to go back in there anytime soon. Later we found out that the ward had been shut down due to numerous complaints about the experiments performed there. The treatments had caused severe side effects, and there were numerous lawsuits and investigations. It seems that the staff at the time tried to cover up the extent of the suffering that occurred there, and the ward was sealed off to hide the evidence. So that's my creepy story. It's a reminder that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried where you think it does. If you're working on an old building or a forgotten area, just remember, sometimes what you find might be better left undisturbed. The weight of what happened there can leave a mark on you, even if you don't believe in ghosts. One of the patients was scaring me until I found out why. I work as a nurse at a psychiatric hospital. It's a demanding job, mentally and emotionally draining, but you need to be tough. Most days it's just me, the constant hum of the lights, and the occasional call from a patient. But a few months ago, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew. It began with a patient I'll call Patient A for privacy reasons. He had been with us for years, battling schizophrenia. One day he started talking about the man in the window. At first I thought it was just another symptom of his illness, something we'd manage with medication and therapy. Patient A was genuinely terrified. He refused to go near windows, saying there was a man outside watching him, even knocking on the glass. I made a note of it, thinking it was just part of his delusions. It wasn't the first time we'd dealt with such things. As days went by, Patient A's fear intensified. He began to scream at night, begging us to close the curtains. He claimed the man wanted to hurt him. We had to move him to a different room, one without a window, but that didn't help. His fear only grew stronger. He said the man was now inside the hospital, appearing in mirrors and hallways. He woke up drenched in sweat, claiming the man was right next to him. The doctors brushed it off. Patients with schizophrenia often experience vivid hallucinations. They thought it was just another episode. But there was something unsettling about Patient A's terror. It seemed too real, too desperate. One night I found Patient A's room empty. My heart skipped a beat. Patients aren't supposed to be wandering around at night. I called for help, and we started searching the hospital. It wasn't long before we found him. He was in an old, unused wing, standing by a window. The area was dimly lit with an eerie, abandoned feel to it. Patient A was staring out the window, mumbling to himself. "He's here. He's here." I looked outside and saw a blurry figure in the overgrown garden below. It was too far to make out clearly, but it looked like a man standing still. I blinked and the figure was gone. I turned back to Patient A, who was screaming that the man was coming in. We managed to get him back to his room and sedated him, but the incident left me rattled. A few days later, while I was on a break, I overheard some older staff talking about a patient who had died years ago. They said he had jumped from a window in the same wing where I had found Patient A. My heart sank as I connected the spot to the story. They said his spirit was said to linger in the hospital, unable to move on. That thought chilled me to the bone. I had heard ghost stories before, but this was different. The connection between Patient A's fear and the story of the patient who died made me uneasy. I spent the rest of the day on edge, every shadow and creak in the old wing feeling like a personal threat. That night, as I walked through the dimly lit corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The old wing was colder than the rest of the hospital, and the air felt heavy. The flickering lights only added to the unease. Every noise seemed amplified, every whisper of the wind outside a potential omen. I had to check on Patient A again, and as I approached his room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and saw him sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror. "He's here," he whispered, pointing toward the window. I checked the room and the window, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I reassured him and closed the curtains, but his fear was palpable. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about everything. The stories, the figure in the garden, and Patient A's terror. I decided to dig deeper. I found records about the patient who had jumped. The details were grim. He had been deeply depressed, and his death was a shock to everyone. There were mentions of unusual occurrences in the hospital after his death, but nothing concrete. That night, as I was driving home, I felt a profound sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, lurking in the shadows of the hospital. When I walked through my front door, I broke down and told my husband everything. I was shaken, my hands trembling as I recounted the events. All I wanted was a big hug. I needed to feel safe, to escape the terror that had followed me home. My husband listened and held me close, and I cried into his shoulder. The fear had been gnawing at me all day, and the thought that something might be haunting the hospital was deeply unsettling. I'm sensitive to these things, and this situation had pushed me to my limits. I know it's part of the job, dealing with patients and their fears, but this was different. The idea that something from the past might still be lurking in the hospital made it harder to do my job. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but wonder if there were other restless souls walking through the hospital. What if there were more spirits, other patients who didn't get to find peace? The thought was terrifying. Knowing that the hospital might be home to other unsettled spirits made the place feel even more ominous. It's a chilling thought, and every time I pass that old wing or hear an unexplained noise, I can't help but wonder if another soul is still wandering, still searching for something they never found. And every shadow seems a little darker, every flicker of light a little more sinister. The story my aunt told me, it's terrifying. I've got a story that I just have to share, something my aunt told me a few years ago. She's been a pediatric nurse for as long as I can remember, and she's always been the type to laugh off ghost stories or anything like that. But this one, she wasn't laughing when she told it. I don't know if she was pulling my leg or if she was dead serious, but it stuck with me. It's creepy as hell, and every time I think about it, I get chills. So this happened about 10 years ago, when my aunt was working at this old pediatric hospital. The place had been around forever, like since the 1920s or something. It had that kind of history where you just know some messed up stuff went down there over the years, but it was still running, still treating kids, so you'd think it'd be a safe place, right? There was this one room 304, that always seemed to have a kid in it. I guess that's how hospitals work, always full, always busy. But what made this room weird was that the kids who stayed there would start talking about the other kid. Every single time, without fail, the kid in 304 would make a new imaginary friend. Now, I know what you're thinking. Kids have imaginary friends all the time, right? No big deal. And that's what the staff thought too, at first. My aunt said the first time she noticed something was off was with this little girl named Sarah. She was about 6 or 7, in for some kind of long-term treatment. Real sweet kid, always drawing pictures or playing quietly with her toys. But after a couple of days in 304, Sarah started talking to the other kid. She didn't name him or anything, just called him the other kid, like it was totally normal to have an extra kid hanging around in her room. The nurses would overhear Sarah having full conversations with this other kid. My aunt told me it wasn't like she was playing pretend either. Sarah would pause, listen, and then respond like there was really someone else in the room with her. The staff just chalked it up to her being lonely or scared, so no one thought much of it. That is, until Sarah started talking about things she shouldn't have known about. One day, my aunt walked into Sarah's room and found her sitting on the bed, talking to the air like usual. But this time, Sarah looked upset, like she'd been crying. My aunt asked her what was wrong, and Sarah said, "The other kid is sad because of the bad doctor." My aunt asked who the bad doctor was, thinking maybe Sarah had overheard something that upset her, but Sarah just shook her head and said, "He's gone now, but he hurt the other kids. He made them go away." Now, my aunt was pretty creeped out by this, but she figured it was just some kind of weird nightmare or misunderstanding. Maybe Sarah had a bad dream or something. But when she asked Sarah to explain, the girl just clammed up and wouldn't say anything more. My aunt was disturbed, but she tried to brush it off. After all, it's a hospital. Kids have all sorts of fears and worries, especially when they're sick. But then Sarah started drawing pictures of the other kid. And these weren't your typical kid drawings. These were detailed, like she was really seeing someone. She drew this boy, maybe 8 or 9, always with sad eyes and standing in a corner. And in some of the pictures, there was a shadowy figure behind him, something that looked like a man in a white coat. Then Sarah got sicker. And I'm not talking about whatever she was in the hospital for. She started getting these weird symptoms that the doctors couldn't explain. Fevers, pain that would come and go, but nothing they could pinpoint as the cause. My aunt said it was like Sarah was wasting away even though she should have been getting better. And then, one night, Sarah had a seizure. It came out of nowhere. The doctors did everything they could, but she didn't make it. The whole staff was devastated because they'd gotten attached to her. But my aunt was haunted by the last thing Sarah said before she seized. She whispered, "The bad doctor is coming." And then she was gone. After Sarah died, the nurses started talking. It turned out that Sarah wasn't the first kid in room 304 to mention the other kid or the bad doctor. There were records, my aunt found them later, that showed almost every kid who stayed in that room for more than a few days had said something similar, and there were a lot of unexplained deaths in that room over the years, way more than in other parts of the hospital. But it was an old hospital, so people just chalked it up to bad luck, or the fact that really sick kids were often put in that room because it was close to the nurses' station. The really creepy part? My aunt said that one of the older nurses, who'd been at the hospital forever, pulled her aside after Sarah died and told her something that still makes my skin crawl. Apparently, back in the 1950s, there was a doctor at the hospital. He was known for being brilliant, but also kind of cold, Like he saw the kids as just patients, not little humans. He was especially interested in some kind of experimental treatments, things that weren't exactly ethical by today's standards. Anyway, the story goes that this doctor had one patient, a little boy who was really sick. The details are fuzzy, but the boy didn't make it. And after he died, rumors started going around that the doctor had done something wrong. Maybe an experiment that went too far, or maybe he just didn't care enough to try to save the kid. Whatever it wasn't good. Shortly after that, the doctor disappeared. The official story was that he moved away, but the staff knew better. They said he killed himself in one of the patient rooms, the same room that would later become 304. After hearing that, my aunt couldn't stop thinking about all the kids who'd stayed in that room, especially the ones who mentioned the bad doctor. She was convinced that the other kid Sarah talked to was the ghost of one of the doctor's patients, trying to warn the living about the doctor's ghost, which was still lingering in the hospital, still hurting kids. The whole thing spooked my aunt so much that she asked to be transferred to a different floor. She couldn't stand walking past room 304 anymore, knowing what had happened to Sarah and all those other kids. She told me this story after a few drinks one night, and I could tell it still bothered her even though she tried to laugh it off. She's not the kind to believe in ghosts, but there was something about that place that got under her skin, and honestly, it got under mine too. I mean, I don't know if I believe in ghosts or any of that, but the way my aunt told it, it felt real. And even if there's some logical explanation, it doesn't change the fact that something really messed up was going on in that hospital. So yeah, whenever someone asks me if I believe in ghosts, I just think of my aunt's story, and I don't know what to say. All I know is if I ever end up in the hospital, I'm asking for a different room. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by leaving a comment below. Your feedback helps me create more content you'll love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more updates. See you in the next video.